Hey folks, Elwood here. Today we find out what cavemen were really up to, and spoiler, it wasn't just rock smashing and slow motion fire moments. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The average day for a caveman began at dawn, or slightly before, depending on how loud the wind was or whether someone nearby started coughing again. Most people slept on animal hides or directly on packed earth, sometimes with a layer of dried grass or leaves for padding. You probably slept near a fire, not for ambience, for heat, and to keep insects and predators away. Sleeping away from the group wasn't really an option unless you wanted to wake up missing a foot. Most people slept in small tight groups. Families, extended families, and whoever else was part of the local band. Privacy didn't exist. Everyone heard everything. The first thing you did after waking up was check the fire. If it went out, someone had to restart it. That could take time, patience, and a lot of rubbing sticks together. If it was cold out, which depending on the season it often was, everyone would be cranky until it came back to life. Next, you might look over your tools and weapons, spears, knives, scrapers, anything that could be used for hunting or protection. These had to be kept in good condition. Losing your tools meant losing your ability to get food, defend yourself, or process meat and hides. Some people in the group were better at this than others, and it wasn't unusual to borrow gear from someone more skilled, though they probably expected something in return. Children were usually the first to make noise. They'd start moving around, looking for something to eat or something to do, often both. Adults would slowly get up and begin preparing for the day. That could mean gathering water, checking nearby traps, or heading out to look for signs of animal movement. No one eased into the day. There was no time for that. Your daily goal was simple: stay warm, find food, and avoid injury. If you woke up in one piece, your fire was still burning, and nothing outside looked immediately dangerous. You were already ahead. In the Paleolithic era, personal hygiene existed, just not in the way we think of it today. Cleanliness was mostly practical, not aesthetic. You cleaned yourself when it started interfering with your ability to live, or when the smell became a group issue. Bathing happened, but it depended heavily on the season and environment. If there was a stream, people washed in it when the water wasn't freezing. Otherwise, cleaning might involve wiping off dirt with leaves, handfuls of sand, or on rare luxury occasions, animal fat. That's right. Fat could be used to scrub the skin, which sounds odd until you realize it also helped with warmth and insect control. Teeth were another story. There were no toothbrushes, but some people chewed fibrous sticks or bones to clean their teeth. Dental wear was common, especially since the Paleolithic diet involved tough meat, unprocessed grains, and sand particles from grinding stones that got into food. Cavemen didn't brush, but they also didn't eat candy, so cavities were rare. Tooth loss from injury or wear, however, was a different matter. Hair care was minimal. Hair was usually long, tied back, or simply ignored. Lice were common. Some groups used ash, dirt, or animal oils to reduce infestations. Others may have resorted to the always effective method of scratching a lot and hoping it goes away. There's also evidence from later prehistoric periods of primitive combs or grooming tools. So some effort was made. Eventually, clothing didn't help matters. Animal hides weren't breathable, and they weren't washed often. If they smelled, people either got used to it or blamed the person sitting closest to the fire. Feet were mostly bare or covered in wraparound hide shoes. As you can imagine, the smell of a prehistoric cave was distinctive. But here's the surprising part. Despite the lack of soap or showers, early humans adapted well. Their immune systems were strong, and their communities understood enough about cleanliness to avoid major outbreaks. In fact, people probably smelled about the same. so no one really noticed unless you did something extreme, like roll in a dead animal, which, by the way, some people did, for camouflage. Breakfast. There was no set time to eat. People ate when they could, what they could, and only if there was anything left over from the day before. If you woke up to find a bit of dried meat still hanging by the fire, congratulations. You'd won the prehistoric lottery, but most mornings didn't start that way. If last night's hunt had failed, or the food was already eaten, or stolen by a raccoon-like creature with ambition, then breakfast meant foraging. This might involve digging for roots, checking nearby berry bushes, or scanning the landscape for edible plants that hadn't already been claimed by animals or children. The choices were seasonal. Spring meant greens, summer brought fruits, and winter brought hunger. Protein was more unpredictable. Small animals like birds, rabbits, or insects were occasionally caught and eaten whole or roasted. Insects were a reliable protein source, even if nobody was particularly excited about it. If you found a termite mound or a handful of grubs, that might become the morning meal. They didn't taste great, but they didn't bite back either. Sometimes you'd share with others, especially within your own family group. But food was a resource, not a courtesy. If someone brought back breakfast, it meant they were either generous or in charge, or both. Water was another priority. Streams, springs, and rivers were the main sources. If you were lucky, if not, puddles had to do. Boiling water wasn't a common practice yet, so most water was consumed raw and occasionally accompanied by bacteria. Your gut either defeated or deeply regretted. Occasionally, there'd be a leftover from the last big hunt, smoked meat, marrow from cracked bones, or dried strips of hide that were technically edible with enough chewing. These were valuable. People stored them high, wrapped or hidden, though nothing could stop a determined child with a stick. So every morning was a new gamble. Maybe you'd find a few berries and a half-roasted squirrel. Maybe you'd find nothing. Either way, no one skipped breakfast on purpose. After breakfast, or the realization that breakfast wasn't happening, the next big task of the day was tool maintenance. Tools weren't just accessories, they were survival equipment. Without a good edge, you couldn't cut meat, scrape hides, or defend yourself. So, a surprising amount of the day was spent hunched over rocks, hitting other rocks, trying to get just the right shape. Welcome to Paleolithic toolmaking, part craftsmanship, part trial and error, and entirely dependent on not smashing your thumb, the raw material of choice. Flint or obsidian, if you were feeling fancy and lived near a volcano. These stones chipped predictably, which meant you could flake off sharp edges and create cutting tools. The basic starter pack included hand axes, scrapers, spearheads, and the very popular rock with a handle. There was no one-size-fits-all. Each tool had a purpose. Some for butchering, others for shaping wood, and some for tasks we still don't fully understand, but probably involved hitting things. Most people made their own tools, but like everything else, some were better at it than others. If someone in the group had a knack for making perfectly balanced spear points, they earned respect and requests. Sharpening tools was constant. A dull edge was basically useless, and worse, dangerous. You'd either hurt yourself or waste time. Stones were ground, flaked, and tested daily, and yes, sometimes this meant spending 2 hours making something that broke after 2 minutes of use. You didn't complain. You just started over. Toolkits were often passed down, traded, or even stolen. If you lost yours, you weren't just embarrassed, you were in serious trouble. The moment you had nothing sharp on hand was usually the moment something with claws showed up. Occasionally, creativity kicked in. Someone might tie a rock to a stick with animal sinew and call it a hammer. Others discovered bone tools, flexible, lightweight, and perfect for fine tasks. These innovations were the seeds of later technological revolutions, even if their inventors were mostly just trying to cut something faster. Once the tools were ready, and breakfast, or the lack thereof, had been resolved, it was time to tackle the main event, the hunt. Hunting in the Paleolithic world wasn't a solo hobby. It was a full team operation, often involving every able-bodied member of the group. Plus one guy who mostly shouted useful things like, "Go left." And that's not a deer. Large animals were the jackpot: mammoths, bison, wild horses. Anything big enough to feed the entire group for a week was worth the risk. But they were also dangerous. Mammoths didn't just stand around waiting to be speared. They were fast, heavy, and had no patience for hairless bipeds with wooden sticks. Planning a hunt took real coordination. Scouts went ahead to track herds. Others prepared traps, pits covered with branches, natural choke points near rivers, or just steep cliffs if the group was feeling ambitious and slightly reckless. Then came the ambush. Yelling, spear throwing, and a lot of running. The hope was that something large would go down, preferably before someone in your group did. For smaller game, deer, boars, or even rabbits, the process was more straightforward. Spears, clubs, and clever ambushes were used. Traps and snares helped too, especially for solo or small group hunters. But even with smaller animals, things went wrong. One misstep, and suddenly you were chasing a pig through the woods while trying to explain to your group how you almost had it. Sometimes the hunting party came back victorious, dragging meat, bones, and bragging rights. Other times they came back with nothing but scrapes and excuses. The wind shifted was a popular one. So was blaming whoever sneezed during the ambush. Meat wasn't just food, it was status. The person who delivered the kill often earned first pick, more respect, and fewer chores that night. But sharing was still common. You needed your group, and burning bridges over meat led to awkward silences around the fire. Hunting wasn't just about survival. It was teamwork, risk, and real-time strategy, all while trying not to get trampled. Not everyone in the Paleolithic world chased mammoths. Some people had a much more practical job, finding things that didn't fight back. Foraging wasn't as dramatic but it was essential, and frankly, more successful most of the time. You didn't always catch a deer, but odds were decent you'd find a berry bush. The foraging crew, often made up of women, older adults, and kids who weren't old enough to throw a spear without hitting a tree, covered a lot of ground. They searched for edible plants, berries, nuts, roots, seeds, mushrooms, and anything else that didn't taste like regret. Knowing what was safe to eat was a matter of experience, trial and error, and unfortunately, the occasional funeral. Foragers developed strong mental maps of their terrain. They remembered which valleys had tubers, which trees dropped the best nuts, and which plants looked edible but definitely weren't. They passed this knowledge down carefully. Mistaking a good route for a poisonous one could turn your afternoon snack into an emergency. But it wasn't all safe and slow-paced. Sometimes foragers had to deal with wildlife too. Competing with birds, squirrels, or even bears over berries was a very real thing. And stepping into a wasp nest while reaching for honey was a mistake no one made twice. Voluntarily. Foraging also meant multitasking. While gathering food, people might also collect firewood, feathers, bark, or herbs for medicine. Children tagged along, learning the ropes and occasionally trying to eat things they shouldn't. You kept an eye on them and tried not to lose track of anyone while arguing over whether that mushroom looked weird this time. The food gathered was often more reliable than hunted meat. Plants don't run away, nuts don't stab you, and if you timed it right, a single day's harvest could feed the group for several meals, or at least provide snacks between failed hunts. Foragers were the quiet heroes of the tribe. They weren't dramatic. They didn't show off. But when the hunting party returned empty-handed, it was the gatherers who saved dinner. If there was one thing that made Paleolithic life even remotely manageable, it was fire. Fire cooked your food, kept you warm, scared off predators, and let you see your own feet after sunset. Without it, your odds of survival dropped fast, which is why every group had an unspoken rule: don't let the fire go out. Someone, usually whoever got the short end of the stick that day, was put on fire duty. This meant keeping an eye on the flames, feeding it with wood, and occasionally panicking if the wind shifted or the coals looked too dim. It wasn't glamorous, but it was essential. You could go without breakfast. You could limp through a bad hunt. But if the fire went out, now that was a group emergency. Starting a fire from scratch wasn't easy. It involved friction-based tools like fire drills or hand-spinning sticks over dry wood. If your hands were cold or your material damp, you could be there all day hoping a tiny ember showed mercy. This is why many groups tried to keep a single fire going at all times. Even when moving camp, in some cases, someone literally carried a glowing coal wrapped in moss or bark to keep the flame alive on the road. This person had one job, and the pressure was very real. Fuel collection was part of the deal too. Dry wood, kindling, animal dung. Whatever burned without exploding was fair game. Children often helped, though they sometimes brought back things that looked flammable but absolutely weren't, like wet logs or half-buried mushrooms. Fire maintenance also had a social side. The fire was the center of camp life. People sat around it, told stories, shared food, and argued about whose turn it was to keep watch. The fire pit was, in a way, the original living room, except if someone fell asleep on duty. It could freeze everyone to death. No one got praise for keeping the fire going, but if it went out, there were no excuses. Just a lot of angry looks and the sentence, "Guess who's making sparks tonight?" Contrary to popular belief, not every prehistoric person lived in a cave. Caves were great if you could find one. Natural shelter, wind protection, and built-in walls. But they weren't always available, especially if other groups or wild animals had already claimed them. So what? Like any determined human, early people built their own homes, sort of. Construction in the Paleolithic era wasn't about aesthetics. There were no blueprints, no architects, and certainly no HOA regulations. The main goal was simple: keep the weather out and the people in. If you lived in an area without usable caves, you probably built huts or shelters from wood, bones, mud, grass, and whatever else was lying around. A solid framework of branches or mammoth ribs would be lashed together with animal sinew or vines, then covered with hides, bark, or packed dirt. The result: a lopsided structure that leaked slightly less than standing outside. Building was a group effort. One person held the sticks, another did the tying, and someone stood nearby pretending they knew what they were doing. If it collapsed halfway through, nobody was surprised. You just picked it up and tried again, this time with extra stick. Weather was always a problem. Rain turned dirt floors into mud pits. Wind could rip hide coverings away, like nature was trying to redecorate. Snow crushed entire shelters if they weren't reinforced. That's why some groups built seasonal structures, light summer huts that could be quickly abandoned, and heavier winter shelters for long, miserable stretches of frozen time. Insulation was a luxury, if you were lucky. Animal hides covered the walls and floor. If not, you just layered up and complained. The fire stayed in the center, ideally with a hole in the roof to let smoke out, though it usually let in just as much cold. Furniture? Not really. A rock to sit on, a flat place to nap, and maybe a pile of hides for sleeping. Luxury was a warm corner with no drafts and a roof that didn't drip. And yet, even with limited materials, prehistoric people managed to build homes that worked. They weren't pretty, but they kept you alive, dryish, and occasionally upright during a windstorm. Parenting in the Paleolithic era came with no manuals, no podcasts, and definitely no baby strollers. Once a child was born, you were immediately responsible for keeping a small, loud, very breakable human alive in a world full of cliffs, predators, and sharp rocks. And you had to do it without losing your spear or your sanity. Childbirth itself was a community event. Painful, messy, and risky. If you survived it, congratulations. Now came the next challenge: keeping your child warm, fed, and from sticking their fingers into the fire out of curiosity, which they did. Frequently, there was no diapers, babies were swaddled in hides or plant fiber, and messes were just part of the job. You learned quickly to always set them down on rocks. Easier cleanup. Mothers usually breastfed for years, since there was no baby formula. And chewing meat for a toddler was not considered efficient. Discipline was practical. If a kid wandered too close to a cliff, you didn't give them a timeout. You grabbed them by the leg and barked something like, "No fall." The stakes were high, and safety rules had to be taught fast. Touching fire, chasing wolves, or trying to eat unknown berries were considered teachable moments. Ideally before anything exploded, burned, or caused hallucinations. But Paleolithic parenting wasn't all danger. Kids played constantly, with sticks, stones, feathers, bugs, anything that looked remotely interesting. Play was how they learned. A child who liked throwing rocks might one day be the tribe's best hunter. A kid who sat still and watched the elders might become a shaman or healer. No one said, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" You just became something, depending on your survival skills and general luck. Older children helped with chores, gathering kindling, fetching water, chasing birds from drying meat. By the time they were 10, they were considered semi-functional members of society. Still annoying, but now useful. There was no formal education, but children learned through observation, repetition, and trial by mud. They didn't have toys. They had nature, and nature didn't come with safety labels. After a long day of hunting, gathering, scraping, dodging wild animals, and parenting without sedation, early humans finally got to enjoy a bit of what we might call downtime. Of course, Paleolithic social life wasn't exactly wine tastings and brunch, but it was something. The heart of social activity was the fire. Once the sun dipped low and visibility dropped too, hope you don't trip over a sleeping dog, the group would circle around the flames, not for a party, but because it was the only source of warmth and light that didn't bite. Still, it served as the tribe's gathering point. Everyone came here to eat, talk, and unwind. Evening conversations weren't small talk about the weather. They were storytelling sessions. People shared their day's events, exaggerated hunts, and told tales about spirits, ancestors, or that one time someone fell into the river chasing a fish. Storytelling wasn't just entertainment. It was how knowledge was passed down. What to eat, what to avoid, where the good hunting spots were. All wrapped in stories complete with dramatic grunts and arm waving. Music and dancing also made appearances. Though it wasn't exactly coordinated, someone would bang two stones together rhythmically. Someone else might hum or chant. And suddenly 3 children would start spinning in circles because no one told them not to. Instruments included hollow bones, stretched high drums, and literally anything that made a vaguely satisfying sound. Bragging was also a big part of social life. If someone had a successful hunt, they would mention it repeatedly. If they made a sharp tool, they'd casually show it off while pretending not to care. Social status wasn't about wealth. It was about skills. Who could hunt? Who could lead? Who could keep the fire going without burning their own eyebrows off? And flirting. Oh, it happened. There weren't many options. So romantic gestures were often subtle. Sharing food, sitting closer to someone, or not laughing when they misidentified a pile of dung as a rare root. Relationships formed slowly, and usually with a quiet understanding that "you didn't throw a rock at me today" was a good sign. Courtship was subtle, practical, and usually involved more grunting than poetry. Still, early humans managed to figure out how to form partnerships somehow, despite the complete lack of scented candles or deodorant. The first step in courtship was proximity. You lived in a small band of maybe 20 to 40 people, which meant your dating pool was basically whoever hadn't already been claimed by someone else or wasn't related to you. Not ideal, but there was no prehistoric version of Tinder, unless you count locking eyes while chewing the same piece of roasted squirrel. Flirting was quiet, and by today's standards, kind of strange. Sharing food was a big deal. If someone gave you the choicest piece of meat or a handful of berries, they didn't technically have to part with. That was interest. Helping someone scrape a hide or carry water. Also a green flag. Early romance was based on effort, not eloquence. Appearance mattered, but only up to a point. You weren't judged on your outfit. Everyone wore some variation of fur and dirt. What counted was your ability to survive. A good hunter or skilled forager had a better shot at attracting a mate than someone who sat by the fire all day carving questionable-looking statues. Pair bonds were often long-term, but not always permanent. People stayed together for cooperation, raising children, sharing food, surviving bad winters. If it wasn't working, a quiet separation occurred. No paperwork, just fewer shared tasks and more awkward silences during group meals. Sexual relationships were probably more flexible than modern assumptions allow. Some anthropologists suggest that early humans were less possessive than later agricultural societies. Group dynamics, survival needs and mobility often shaped relationship norms more than personal jealousy. And, of course, there were no love songs, just quiet companionship, a shared blanket, and the mutual understanding that neither of you wanted to get eaten alone. It may not have looked romantic, but it worked. Paleolithic couples built families, raised children, and made it through storms, all without once arguing about who forgot to do the dishes. Mostly because there were no dishes, despite the constant need to hunt, gather, and not die. Early humans still found time for something uniquely human: art. And while they didn't have galleries, museums, or the phrase that's very abstract, they did have walls, big, cold, cave walls, and apparently those were just begging for decoration. The earliest known cave paintings date back over 30,000 years, with famous examples found in places like Lascaux and Chauvet in modern-day France. These weren't random doodles. They featured animals like bison, deer, horses, and mammoths, often drawn with surprising accuracy and motion. Some had lines showing movement, others had dots, handprints, or symbols whose meaning we still haven't cracked. What tools did they use? Nothing fancy, just natural pigments like charcoal, ochre, and manganese, crushed minerals mixed with water, fat, or spit. For brushes, they used fingers, sticks, chewed up ends of plants, or hollow bones to spray pigment across their stenciled hands. Yes, prehistoric people invented airbrushing long before it showed up on motorcycles. Why did they paint? No one knows for sure. Maybe it was storytelling, maybe spiritual beliefs, maybe someone just had an eye for composition, and no one told them to stop. Some anthropologists believe the art was connected to hunting rituals, a way to summon success or pass on knowledge about which animals to chase and which ones to avoid. The artists probably worked by firelight, deep inside caves, in places no one lived, meaning they were making art just to make it. No commercial gain, no Instagram followers, just human expression in the rawest form. Kids likely got in on it too. Some caves include tiny handprints, suggesting that even little ones were taught how to make their mark, literally. And while we'll never know who made the first bison sketch, odds are someone stood behind them, grunting in approval or offering very unhelpful critiques. What's remarkable is that this art lasted long after the huts rotted and the fire pits crumbled. Those painted animals still gallop cave walls. Proof that even 30,000 years ago, humans needed more than just food and shelter. They needed to create. Also, maybe they just really liked bison. Getting sick or injured in the Paleolithic era was a bit like rolling dice with the universe. Only the dice were made of bone and had mostly bad sides. There were no hospitals, no antibiotics, and definitely no urgent care. If you broke something, cut yourself, or developed a mysterious rash, the best case scenario was that your body handled it. The worst case scenario, well, everyone gathered awkwardly around your fire and hoped it didn't look contagious. Medical care existed, but it was basic, extremely basic. Early humans likely had some understanding of plants that reduced pain or inflammation. Chewed bark, roots, or crushed herbs might have served as primitive medicine. Willow bark, for instance, contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. So somewhere out there, a Paleolithic person was the first to discover pain relief by gnawing on a tree. For wounds, treatment often involved cleaning the area with water or antiseptic plants. If known, wrapping it in animal hide or moss, and then watching it closely. Infection was the real killer, not the injury itself. There were no sterile bandages. If the wound got red, hot, and started to smell, well, that was the smell of bad news. Broken bones. Sometimes they healed, sometimes they didn't. There's archaeological evidence of prehistoric skeletons with healed fractures, suggesting that care was given and rest was enforced. But there were also people who clearly kept moving on bad limbs, because there wasn't much choice. Toothaches were another issue. Teeth wore down from constant chewing of tough meat and grit-filled plants. Cavities weren't common, but tooth decay and jaw infections did happen. The solution? Removal, with a rock, and no anesthesia. Shamans or medicine people may have served as early doctors, part herbalist, part spiritual guide, part person who was willing to touch pus. They used rituals, chants, and substances we might now consider mildly hallucinogenic. Was it science? No. Did it work? Sometimes. The truth is, medical care back then was a you got attention, and sometimes you got lucky. And if you didn't, your spot by the fire went to someone else by nightfall. In the Paleolithic world, there were no wagons, no wheels, no roads, and absolutely no concept of catching a ride. If you wanted to go somewhere, you walked. That was it. Travel wasn't a convenience. It was a physical commitment. Whether you were moving camp, following game, or avoiding the neighbors who kept stealing your firewood, it always meant using your own 2 feet. Mobility was essential. Paleolithic groups were typically nomadic, moving as needed based on seasons, food availability, and possibly just to escape the smell of the old camp. Campsites didn't come with leases. Once the local resources were used up or the mammoths moved on, the people followed. Trips could be short, a day's walk to a nearby hunting ground, or much longer, spanning dozens of miles over several days or even weeks. Everything had to be carried: tools, hides, fire-starting gear, food, if there was any left, and children all had to be packed up and hauled on your back. There were no suitcases, just bags made from leather, or baskets made from woven reeds. And don't forget the weather. Traveling meant exposure, rain, wind, snow. You endured it all, possibly while trying to convince a tired 5-year-old that yes, they really did have to keep walking. Again, uphill. Navigation wasn't done with maps. People used memory, landmarks, star patterns, animal tracks, and oral knowledge passed through generations. That mountain that looks like a sleeping bear, or the bend in the river that smells funny, were as close to street signs as you got. Group movement had to be organized. Scouts might go ahead to check for threats. Everyone else moved carefully, often in single file. If someone got injured, the entire group slowed down. If the weather turned, you found shelter. Fast. Speed was important, but so was staying together. Getting separated in prehistoric wilderness was rarely survivable. Despite all that, people covered serious ground. Fossils and artifacts show that Paleolithic humans migrated across continents. On foot, no GPS, no water bottles, no Spotify. Just survival, sore feet, and the unshakable human drive to see what was beyond the next hill. After a long day of hunting, gathering, walking, parenting, tool fixing, and generally not dying, early humans ended their day in the only place that made sense. Around the fire, the sun dropped quickly, and with no electric lights or lanterns, darkness arrived fast and without negotiation. That's when the group settled in for the night's final act. Equal parts winding down and survival maintenance. Dinner, if you were lucky, involved roasted meat, boiled roots, or whatever edible thing didn't escape earlier. Meals were shared communally, everyone sitting in a loose circle, crouched or cross-legged, eating with hands, bones, or the occasional sharpened stick. There was no formal etiquette, but unspoken rules definitely applied. For example, don't snatch the last bite unless you were the one who speared it. After eating, people talked, not just survival plans or food logistics. They shared stories, myths, memories, Cautionary tales about that one guy who tried to hug a porcupine. Oral storytelling was the Paleolithic version of Netflix minus buffering. These stories passed down knowledge, entertained kids, and probably exaggerated everyone's hunting skills by at least 30%. Sometimes there was singing, rhythmic, simple chants or calls passed between voices. A piece of bone might double as a flute, a hollow log, drum. The music wasn't polished, but it didn't have to be. It kept the cold away just a little longer. By now, most people were physically drained. The day didn't leave much energy for deep philosophical discussions. Kids passed out first, curled up next to parents or in a pile of furs. Adults lingered longer, staring into the fire like it held answers. Or maybe just zoning out. Same thing. Before sleep, someone always checked the fire. The unsung hero of the group. If the flames looked low, they were fed. If the wind shifted, barriers were adjusted. And if someone forgot to check, well, they'd hear about it first thing in the morning. In December 1938, two German scientists, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, bombarded uranium with neutrons. And the results were baffling. They hadn't just altered the element, they had split it. Nuclear fission had just been discovered. Word of the experiment raced through the global physics community like a lightning strike. And while the implications were still theoretical, one thing was instantly clear. If fission could be controlled and harnessed, it could unleash an explosion of unimaginable power. And that terrified the scientific world, especially in the United States, because Nazi Germany, home to some of the brightest physicists on Earth, had just taken the first step toward a doomsday weapon. Physicist Leo Szilard, a Hungarian Jew who had fled Europe, immediately grasped the stakes. If Hitler's scientists built an atomic bomb first, the world wouldn't just lose a war, it might lose its future. Alongside fellow refugee Albert Einstein, Szilard drafted a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, warning that the Germans might be working on exactly that. Einstein signed it. The letter was delivered in October 1939, less than 2 months after World War II had begun. Roosevelt didn't rush into action, but he didn't ignore it either. He formed an advisory committee on uranium. Funding trickled in, slowly. At first, the United States simply wasn't ready to take nuclear physics seriously as a weapon of war. That would soon change. By 1941, the British had confirmed the bomb's feasibility. Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor. The US had entered the war. And what started as a vague concern suddenly became a high-stakes, time-sensitive race. Enter General Leslie Groves, a no-nonsense military man who just built the Pentagon. He was appointed head of the newly minted Manhattan Engineer District in 1942. Its purpose, simple on paper, build an atomic bomb before the Nazis did. In practice, it was the most secretive, expensive, and scientifically complex project ever attempted. Groves brought in a young, flamboyant theoretical physicist to lead the science. J. Robert Oppenheimer, brilliant, controversial, idealistic, a man who could calculate particle probabilities and quote Sanskrit poetry in the same breath. Together, they launched what would become known as the Manhattan Project, a $2 billion gamble that would forever change the nature of warfare and the fate of the world. The Manhattan Project wasn't just a lab experiment, it was an empire. To pull off the impossible, the US government created an entire hidden civilization, stretching across the country. Shrouded in secrecy, no one outside the project knew its real purpose. Most of the people inside didn't either. At the heart of this secret world were 3 main sites. First, Los Alamos, New Mexico, a dusty mesa chosen for its remoteness. This would be the brain of the project, where theoretical physics met practical engineering. Here, Oppenheimer assembled a dream team of scientists: Niels Bohr, Richard Feynman, Enrico Fermi, and dozens of others. Many were European émigrés fleeing fascism. Some had no idea what they were truly building. Second, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, were entire factories as long as several football fields were built from scratch. Their mission: enrich uranium. one of the two elements needed for an atomic bomb. Problem was, uranium-235 was incredibly rare, less than 1% of natural uranium. So engineers tried everything: gaseous diffusion, electromagnetic separation, even calotrons. Thousands of workers, most of them women, operated machinery they didn't understand, never knowing they were helping enrich bomb fuel. Third, Hanford, Washington, where plutonium was bred. This was the second path to the bomb. Plutonium didn't occur naturally in usable amounts, but in huge nuclear reactors built in the middle of nowhere. Uranium could be bombarded to produce it. Then it had to be extracted, refined, and shipped to Los Alamos for weaponization. The reactors ran around the clock, creating a new element and new nightmares. Radiation leaks, contamination, and the birth of the nuclear age's environmental costs all began here. Over 130,000 people worked on the Manhattan Project, more than the population of some US states at the time. They built secret towns, complete with housing, schools, stores, and security fences. Mail was censored. Phone calls were monitored. Workers were told only what they needed to know. Even Vice President Harry Truman had no idea what the project was until he became president. This wasn't just a science project. It was industrial, military, bureaucratic, and deeply human. People fell in love, gave birth, suffered accidents, got bored, and died, all in service of an invention they couldn't name. The project had become a hidden America, and it was inching closer, day by day, to building the deadliest weapon in history. Robert Oppenheimer wasn't your typical military contractor. He wasn't even a typical scientist. Brilliant, erratic, aristocratic, and deeply philosophical, Oppenheimer spoke 6 languages, quoted the Bhagavad Gita, and smoked constantly. He had a sharp tongue, fragile health, and an uncanny ability to solve theoretical puzzles that stumped everyone else. To many, he seemed more poet than physicist, but under pressure, he was the glue that held Los Alamos together. Appointed scientific director of the Manhattan Project by General Groves, Oppenheimer quickly proved he was more than just an academic. He had an intuitive understanding of people and politics. He could inspire loyalty and manage egos. No small feat considering he was working with some of the most brilliant minds on Earth, each with a Nobel Prize-level intellect and a reputation to match. But he also had a dark side. Oppenheimer's earlier associations with Communist Party members, including his brother and his mistress, Jean Tatlock, raised red flags for military intelligence. Groves overruled objections and pushed ahead with Oppenheimer anyway. But the file on him was thick and getting thicker. Still, Oppenheimer's ability to visualize how theoretical physics could become physical machinery made him indispensable. At Los Alamos, he led with a mix of charisma and obsession. Often sleeping just a few hours a night, he'd race between chalkboards and meetings, scribbling formulas, arguing designs, and chain-smoking until dawn. He was at the center of everything: atomic configurations, bomb casing designs, neutron reflectors, even the seating charts at briefings. He was also painfully aware of the consequences. Oppenheimer believed beating the Nazis to the bomb was morally necessary. But as the war in Europe neared its end, and Germany's nuclear program collapsed, he grew uneasy. The bomb was no longer just a defensive weapon. It was becoming a political weapon. This paradox haunted him. He had summoned the greatest minds of the age to unleash destruction never before imagined. Every success brought them closer not to victory, but to a line that, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. In private, Oppenheimer remained conflicted. In public, he remained focused. As the team finalized bomb designs, one chilling truth grew clearer. They wouldn't just be changing warfare. They'd be changing the nature of humanity's relationship with power itself. By late 1944, theory had given way to blueprints. Blueprints became parts. Parts became prototypes. The Manhattan Project was no longer an experiment. It was an assembly line for Armageddon. But building a nuclear bomb wasn't like building a tank or a plane. This was uncharted territory. And nothing came easy. Engineers, machinists and physicists at Los Alamos were now focused on two types of bombs, each with its own terrifying complexity. The first was the uranium bomb, nicknamed Little Boy. It relied on the principle of a gun-type mechanism. Fire one chunk of uranium, 235 into another at high speed, and you get a chain reaction. Simple in concept, horrifying in practice. The enriched uranium came from Oak Ridge, Tennessee, in tiny, hard-earned quantities. Each gram took enormous effort, and they needed over 60 kilograms. Every calculation had to be perfect. There would be no test run. Little Boy would go straight to the battlefield. The second bomb, Fat Man, used plutonium. But plutonium was trickier. A gun-type design wouldn't work. Plutonium would pre-detonate, fizzling out before it reached full power. Instead, they had to develop a completely different method. Implosion. This meant precisely timed explosive lenses would compress a plutonium core into a critical mass in microseconds. It was like trying to crush a steel ball evenly from all sides using dynamite without cracking the shell. To make matters worse, plutonium was toxic, unstable, and newly invented. The scientists worked under extreme secrecy and stress. Accidents happened. In 1945, physicist Harry Daghlian accidentally dropped a tungsten brick into a plutonium core, initiating a critical reaction. He absorbed a lethal dose of radiation and died weeks later. The demon core, as it was called, would kill another scientist, Louis Slotin, months later in an eerily similar accident. Every step forward carried a cost, physically, mentally, morally. Meanwhile, time was running out. Germany had surrendered, Japan fought on, and Washington wanted results. The scientists at Los Alamos knew what they were making, but not where it would go or who it would kill. Inside the workshops, the final pieces were coming together. Metal casings, precision detonators, nuclear cores, each component a marvel of science. Together, they would form humanity's most lethal invention. The only thing left now was to test it, not in theory, not in simulation, in fire, in desert, in real life. On July 16th, 1945, at precisely 5:29 a.m., the New Mexico desert turned into the birthplace of the nuclear age. The test was codenamed Trinity, and it was the first detonation of nuclear device in human history. The bomb they tested was a plutonium implosion design, the same type as Fat Man. It had never been tested before, unlike Little Boy, which the scientists believed would work based on simple physics. Fat Man's complex implosion mechanism made it unpredictable. It could fail, it could fizzle, or it could destroy everything around them. Tension ran high. Oppenheimer, Groves, and hundreds of scientists gathered at observation points miles from the detonation site. Many wore welding goggles. Some had sunscreen smeared on their faces, hoping it would protect them from the unknown light that was about to be born. Others took bets on whether the blast would ignite the atmosphere. It sounds absurd now, but back then, they genuinely weren't sure. At the exact moment of detonation, the desert exploded with a flash brighter than the sun. The shockwave knocked people off their feet. The heat could be felt over 10 miles away. A mushroom cloud soared 40,000 feet into the sky. The earth itself seemed to pause. One observer described it as being present at the birth of the world. Another said it felt like the gates of hell had opened. Oppenheimer didn't cheer. He whispered a line from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The test was a success, a terrifying, undeniable success. It confirmed that the United States now possessed a weapon that could annihilate entire cities in seconds. But it also marked the beginning of a profound moral reckoning. Photographs were taken, measurements recorded, glass-like sand, now called trinitite, formed at ground zero. But what lingered most wasn't scientific data. It was silence, awe, and the haunting awareness that mankind had crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed. News of the test was kept tightly sealed. President Truman, then attending the Potsdam Conference in Germany, was informed via a coded message. The baby is born. The war was still raging in the Pacific. Japan had not yet surrendered, and now, the United States held the power of annihilation. The question wasn't if they would use it, it was where and when. Less than a month after the Trinity test, the theoretical horror became a real one. The United States had 2 working bombs and a fateful decision to make. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay lifted off from Tinian Island. Its payload: Little Boy, the uranium bomb, the target, Hiroshima, a city of military importance, but also full of civilians. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb was released. 43 seconds later, the sky erupted. The explosion leveled 5 square miles of the city. Temperatures reached 7000 degrees Fahrenheit at the epicenter. Over 70,000 people died instantly, vaporized or crushed. Fires raged. Survivors, burned and blinded, stumbled through a nightmare landscape of twisted steel and ash. In the following weeks, tens of thousands more would die from radiation sickness, injuries and trauma. The world had never seen destruction like this. And yet, the war continued. Japan's leaders hesitated. Some wanted surrender, others wanted terms. The US, interpreting silence as resistance, prepared a second strike. On August 9th, the plutonium bomb, Fat Man, was loaded onto another B-29 boxcar. The primary target was Kokura, but cloud cover forced a change. The bomb was dropped over Nagasaki at 11:02 a.m. The terrain of Nagasaki limited the blast somewhat, but the destruction was still catastrophic. Around 40,000 people died instantly. The blast obliterated factories, homes, temples. Once again, thousands more would succumb in the following days from burns, trauma and radiation. Within hours, the Japanese cabinet convened in chaos. The emperor himself, Hirohito, intervened. For the first time in history, a Japanese emperor spoke directly to his people, announcing unconditional surrender. The war was over, but the debate had just begun. Did the bombs end the war, or did they usher in something worse? Were they necessary, or a horrific show of force? Some scientists had begged for a demonstration instead of a city strike. Their pleas were ignored. Others, like General Groves, felt no remorse at all. The world had entered a new reality, one where peace was enforced by the threat of absolute destruction. The bomb had done its job, militarily, but morally, philosophically, spiritually. Those questions would echo for generations. What was undeniable? In 2 flashes of light, the 20th century had split. There was the world before the bomb, and everything that came after. The mushroom clouds had barely settled before the world, and especially those involved, began to wrestle with what had just happened. At Los Alamos, the celebrations were muted. Yes, the bomb had worked. Yes, the war was over, but the scale of devastation stunned even those who had built it. Photos of charred bodies and flattened cities reached the laboratories. Survivors' stories trickled in. Scientists who once poured their genius into making the weapon now stared into an ethical abyss. Many felt they'd unleashed something far bigger than they understood. Oppenheimer, in particular, was shattered. Though once the charismatic heart of the Manhattan Project, he was now a man haunted. In a meeting with President Truman shortly after the war, he reportedly said, "Mr. President, I feel I have blood on my hands." Truman, according to his staff, was disgusted. He later called Oppenheimer a crybaby scientist.
But the ethical crisis wasn't confined to one man. Scientists like Leo Szilard and James Frank circulated petitions urging transparency and international control of nuclear weapons. They warned that secrecy and unchecked arsenals would lead to an arms race. Their reports were ignored. Instead, the US tightened control over nuclear research. The Atomic Energy Commission was formed. The Cold War began to simmer, and the Soviets, already aware of the Manhattan Project thanks to extensive espionage, were racing to build a bomb of their own. Meanwhile, many Manhattan Project workers, especially those at Oak Ridge and Hanford, began to learn, often for the first time, what they had been a part of. Some were proud, others were horrified. The public, too, was split. American newspapers cheered the end of the war, but slowly, images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki began to appear. Questions followed. Could Japan have been forced to surrender another way? Were both bombs necessary? Was this justice or vengeance? And then came the reality of radiation. Survivors of the bombings, Hibikusha, as they came to be known, suffered burns, cancers, miscarriages, and lifelong stigma. Fallout studies began. The long-term toll wasn't just physical, it was generational. DNA damage, birth defects, psychological trauma. The war had ended, but the consequences were only beginning. The Manhattan Project had achieved its goal, but left behind a legacy of sorrow, secrecy, and ethical confusion that would define the nuclear age. Science had broken through a barrier, but humanity hadn't caught up. While the bomb was being built in secret deserts and hidden labs, it wasn't as secret as the US government had hoped, even as America celebrated its newfound atomic dominance. Cracks in its security had already begun to widen, and Soviet agents had already slipped through. The Manhattan Project had been compromised from nearly the beginning. Thanks to Soviet espionage networks, the USSR knew about the bomb long before it was dropped. Key scientists, including Klaus Fuchs, a theoretical physicist working at Los Alamos, were quietly funneling details of the weapon's design straight to Moscow. Fuchs's information was so precise that Soviet engineers later admitted they used his data as a template when building their own bomb. He wasn't alone. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, American civilians with communist ties, were accused of passing atomic secrets to the Soviets. Their eventual trial and execution in 1953 shocked the nation and became one of the most controversial episodes in Cold War history. Whether they were scapegoats or genuine traitors remains debated. But the message was clear. The nuclear genie was out and no longer in just one country's hands. The Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb in 1949, just 4 years after Hiroshima. It was faster than most American officials had expected. The world was now a multi-nuclear landscape, and the arms race was officially on. America's monopoly on ultimate destruction had lasted less than half a decade. What followed was a new kind of warfare. Not of bullets, but of brinkmanship. Nations now held weapons that could annihilate cities with a single strike. The logic of conflict shifted. Victory no longer meant who had more troops. It meant who could survive a nuclear first strike or deliver a deadlier one in return. Back in the US, paranoia grew. Loyalty oaths, background checks, HUAC hearings, the Red Scare. Scientists who had once been hailed as national heroes found themselves accused, blacklisted and interrogated. Oppenheimer himself, the father of the bomb, was stripped of his security clearance in a humiliating hearing that exposed how deeply the political climate had changed. The bomb had won a war, but it had also ignited a new one. Colder, more psychological and infinitely more dangerous. From the labs of Los Alamos to the gulags of Siberia, a new era had begun. One where silence, suspicion and surveillance reigned, and the threat of total annihilation would never be far behind. The Manhattan Project ended in 1946, but its impact never did. It reshaped the world, scientifically, militarily, politically, and morally. It was, in many ways, the birth of the modern era. On one hand, the project marked an unprecedented scientific achievement. It proved that theoretical physics could shape global events, that pure research could transform into raw power. The same principles that split atoms would go on to power nuclear energy, guide space exploration, and advance medicine. Nuclear physics became a cornerstone of modern science. On the other hand, it introduced a permanent shadow over humanity. The invention of nuclear weapons didn't just end a war, it redefined peace. For the first time in history, humans had created something that could wipe themselves out entirely. That terrifying possibility has hovered over every international conflict since. The concept of mutually assured destruction became the twisted backbone of Cold War diplomacy.
Two superpowers, armed to the teeth, locked in a stalemate where pulling the trigger meant the end of civilization. The Manhattan Project also sparked a global arms race. The US, the Soviet Union, then Britain, France, China, India, Pakistan, Israel, unofficially, and later North Korea, each developed their own bombs. What began as a desperate gamble to stop Nazi Germany became a blueprint for global militarization. And yet, for all its devastation, the bomb has only been used in war twice. That fact alone is both chilling and remarkable. It suggests a paradox. The bomb is the ultimate weapon, and its horror may be the very reason it hasn't been used again. Culturally, the Manhattan Project left scars. In film, literature, and philosophy, it forced a confrontation with the limits of progress. Could science exist without conscience? Could knowledge be separated from responsibility? Figures like Oppenheimer remain icons of that dilemma. Neither villain nor hero, just human, caught between brilliance and guilt, ambition and regret. In 1965 he reflected, in some sort of crude sense, which no vulgarity, no humor, no overstatement can quite extinguish. The physicists have known sin. Today, the legacy of the Manhattan Project lives on, in weapons stockpiles, in non-proliferation treaties, in climate of deterrence, and in the uneasy peace that nuclear fear enforces. The bomb ended a world war, but it began something else too. A permanent, fragile era, where the fate of the world can hinge on the press of a button. In ancient Mesopotamia, what you wore wasn't just about covering your body, it was about broadcasting your identity, your class, occupation, gender, and even your closeness to the gods were reflected in your clothing. Fashion here was an elaborate code, and everyone, from priest kings to slaves, was expected to follow it. The earliest civilizations in Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria developed distinct clothing hierarchies. For men, garments ranged from simple skirts made of wool or flax to long, elaborately fringed robes. These robes were symbols of status. The more layers, pleats, and embroidery you had, the more powerful you were perceived to be. Royalty and nobility often favored cloaks dyed with expensive pigments, deep reds, purples, and indigos extracted from rare minerals and plants. These dyes weren't just visually striking, they were costly to produce. So wearing them shouted wealth and authority. Women's clothing was no less symbolic. Elite women wore finely woven gowns that wrapped diagonally across the body and often left one shoulder bare. Decorative fringes along the hems were a recurring feature. Jewelry was essential. Gold necklaces, lapis lazuli earrings, and carnelian beads were used not only to enhance beauty, but to signify divine favor or aristocratic lineage. Bracelets, anklets, and hairpieces reflected both spiritual beliefs and marital status. Even hairstyles were strategic. Mesopotamian men took pride in their beards, which were curled, oiled, and sometimes crimped into intricate patterns. Beards were not just facial hair, they were a badge of masculinity and wisdom. Women, meanwhile, styled their hair in buns, braids, and elaborate rolls. Wigs were worn by both sexes on ceremonial occasions, or by the upper classes to show refinement. Perfumes and cosmetics added the final layer. Oils scented with myrrh or cedar were commonly used to anoint the skin. Eye makeup, often kohl, was applied not only for beauty, but for protection against evil spirits and the sun's glare. And let's not forget shoes, or the lack thereof. Most Mesopotamians went barefoot, but elites sometimes wore sandals made of leather or even silver, purely for ceremony. In Mesopotamia, fashion wasn't frivolous. It was deeply functional, symbolic, and enforced by religious and political institutions. What you wore could elevate you or condemn you. Even 5,000 years ago, people knew appearances weren't just skin deep, they were destiny. In ancient Egypt, fashion served a divine function. What you wore didn't just signal wealth or taste, it reflected your connection to the gods. Clothing was about purity, power, and eternal style. And in a land where life and death were closely intertwined, your wardrobe had to be fit for both this world and the next. Linen was king.
derived from flax. It was the primary fabric for all Egyptians, soft, lightweight, and perfect for the desert heat. But not all linen was equal. The upper class wore finely woven, almost transparent linen that clung to the body in elegant folds. Pharaohs and nobility wore pleated kilts and robes with ornate sashes, often starched and shaped to dramatic effect. The whiter and finer the linen, the more it symbolized purity and favor with the gods. For women, fashion was both sensual and symbolic. Elite women wore sheath dresses, known as calasiris, that were tight-fitting and often supported with shoulder straps. These dresses left little to the imagination. But in Egyptian culture, beauty and fertility were divine virtues. Clothing was designed to highlight the natural form. Modesty, as we know it today, wasn't the goal. Harmony and sacred aesthetics were. Jewelry was more than adornment. It was spiritual armor. Amulets shaped like scarabs, ankhs, and eyes of Horus were common. Gold was the preferred metal of the gods, believed to be incorruptible. Necklaces like the broad collar, or wesek, were worn by both genders and layered with precious stones. Turquoise, lapis lazuli, and carnelian. These weren't just pretty. They offered protection and favor from the divine. Wigs were a daily fashion choice for elites. While most Egyptians shaved their heads for hygiene and to ward off lice, wigs, made of human hair or plant fibers, signaled rank and beauty. Some were enormous, intricately braided, and perfumed with cones of scented wax that melted in the heat, releasing fragrance throughout the day. Makeup was essential. Kohl eyeliner wasn't just stylish. It protected the eyes from the sun's glare and was believed to ward off evil spirits. Men and women both wore green malachite eyeshadow and red ochre lip stain. Looking good was serious business because the gods were always watching. From pyramid workers to priests to queens, what you wore in Egypt wasn't just a fashion choice. It was a sacred statement about your status, your soul, and your journey into eternity. At first glance, ancient Greek fashion might seem simple. Flowing fabrics, minimal seams, and clean lines. But look closer, and you'll see a world coded with identity, status, and civic values. In Greece, especially during the classical period, clothing wasn't about extravagance. It was about order, proportion, and philosophy. Literally, Greek garments were typically made from rectangular pieces of wool or linen, artfully draped and pinned rather than cut or tailored. The most iconic outfit was the chiton, a tunic fastened at the shoulders and belted at the waist. Men's chitons were usually knee-length, while women's reached the ankles. But even that length was a message. Long chitons on men signaled youth or priesthood, while short ones meant athleticism, labor, or military life. Over the chiton, both genders might wear a himation, a large cloak draped over one shoulder. Philosophers famously wore it wrapped tightly, creating a dignified, severe look that mirrored their stoic ideals. The himation became a silent advertisement for intellect and civic virtue. Women also wore the peplos, a heavier woolen garment folded over at the top, creating a double layer across the torso. This fold, called the apoptygma, was both decorative and symbolic. It highlighted modesty and femininity, ideals prized in Athenian society. The way a woman wore her peplos could signal her marital status, her mourning, or even her alignment with religious festivals. Color played a subtle but important role. White was associated with purity and ceremony. Dark garments were worn during mourning. Saffron yellow and rich purples, though rare and expensive, appeared during special rituals or in elite households. Patterns were minimal, but geometric borders and embroidery along the hem or neckline added visual weight and social distinction. Hair and accessories were carefully curated. Men often kept their hair short, while women's hairstyles varied widely. Braids, buns, and curls all had their season. Jewelry was elegant but restrained. Gold earrings, intricate hairpins, and bracelets shaped like snakes or leaves. Shoes were optional. Many Greeks went barefoot at home or during ritual events. When they did wear footwear, it was typically simple leather sandals or soft boots. Form met function.
Greek fashion was elegance through discipline. In a society obsessed with balance and virtue, the drape of a tunic or the tie of a sash wasn't just aesthetic. It was a reflection of how one lived, thought, and contributed to the polis. If the Greeks used fashion to express ideals, the Romans used it to display dominance.
Roman clothing was bold, regulated, and highly symbolic, designed to reflect the empire's strict social hierarchy and its love for spectacle and control. What you wore in Rome wasn't just a personal choice. It was often a legal requirement. The most iconic Roman garment was the toga, and it wasn't for comfort, reserved for Roman male citizens only, especially the elite. The toga was a massive semicircular woolen cloth draped intricately over the body. It required practice or a personal slave to wear properly. The color, size, and decorative stripe of your toga immediately signaled your status. A toga virilis, plain and white, was worn by adult male citizens. A toga praetexta, with a purple border, was for magistrates and high-ranking boys. The fully purple toga picta, embellished with gold, was reserved for generals in triumphal processions and eventually emperors. To wear the wrong toga could result in public disgrace, or worse. Underneath, men wore a tunica, a simpler knee-length garment belted at the waist. Slaves wore rough, undyed tunics. Freedmen might wear striped versions to distinguish their new, albeit limited, status. Senators had a purple stripe called a latus clavus down the front. Fashion in Rome wasn't about individualism. It was about knowing your place. Roman women, meanwhile, wore the stola, a long flowing dress often paired with the palla, a shawl that could cover the head in public. Respectable matrons wore distinct stoli as a badge of their chastity and virtue. Prostitutes, by contrast, were banned from wearing them. A literal fashion divide between dignity and disgrace. Jewelry was abundant, especially among women. Rings, necklaces, fibulae, brooches and earrings were not just decorations, they were currency, status markers and political gifts. Wealthy women wore elaborate hairstyles, often piled high with curls, braids and pins, a fashion that required both a mirror and several servants. Footwear ranged from simple sandals to leather boots dyed red, green or black. Senators even had their own shoe style, the calceus, marked by a black leather finish and laces across the ankle. In Rome, clothing was law. Art and propaganda rolled into one. To be dressed appropriately was to embody Rome's values, discipline, hierarchy, conquest and civic pride. A toga wasn't just cloth, it was the Roman Republic. Draped in wool, in the Achaemenid Persian Empire, fashion was nothing short of regal theater. From Darius the Great to Xerxes, Persian rulers dressed not merely to impress but to intimidate. To see a Persian nobleman walk into a room was to witness a human jewel box, shimmering in embroidered silks, gold ornaments and divine iconography. Clothing here was about power, but also about cosmology. Unlike the more minimalist Greeks, Persians embraced vivid colors and luxurious textures. Silk, which reached Persia via early trade routes, was reserved for the embroidery was everything. Tunics and robes were heavily decorated with gold thread, mythical animal motifs, and elaborate patterns symbolizing fertility, protection, and divine favor. The more detailed your garment, the higher your position and the closer your aura was to the king. Men typically wore long-sleeved tunics with trousers underneath, innovative for the time. Unlike other ancient societies where robes dominated, Persians adopted fitted pants for both practicality and fashion. It was revolutionary and would later influence Greek, Roman, and even medieval dress. A wide, ornate belt often cinched the tunic at the waist, while layered cloaks draped across the shoulders added weight and formality. Women's fashion was equally refined, though modest by design. Long dresses with fitted bodices and multiple layers of fabric were common, along with wide sleeves and veils. Jewelry was abundant: gold necklaces, gemstone bracelets, and intricately carved rings. Perfume and cosmetics also featured heavily. Women wore rouge, kohl eyeliner, and scented oils stored in elegant alabaster jars.
Headgear was critical. The tiara, or kidaris, a tall, pointed headdress often decorated with pearls or embroidery, was a signature of Persian royalty. Even lower-rank courtiers wore embroidered caps or turbans as a sign of affiliation and loyalty to the king. The more elaborate your headgear, the closer you were to the throne. Colors had meaning too. Deep blues and purples were reserved for royalty and high nobility. White represented purity and was often worn by priests during sacred rituals. Red and gold were symbols of fire, the sacred element of Zoroastrianism, Persia's dominant faith. Persian fashion was never accidental.
Every fold, every gem, every stitched griffin or lion carried a message. The cosmos is ordered, the king is divine, and you, based on your clothes, better know your place in it. In ancient India, fashion was an art form tied intimately to religion, climate and cosmic balance, from the Vedic period through the Maurya and Gupta empires. Indian clothing reflected a deep philosophical worldview, where texture, color and drapery were not just aesthetic, but sacred. The cornerstone of ancient Indian fashion was unstitched cloth. Instead of tailoring, garments were wrapped, folded and draped in a variety of regional and symbolic styles. This wasn't a shortcut. It was a principle. In Hindu belief, stitching was sometimes considered impure for ritual wear. So flowing fabrics became the canvas of self-expression and spiritual identity. For men, the most common garment was the dhoti, a rectangular piece of often white or saffron, wrapped around the waist and tied in a knot. It could be formal or casual, and the style of folding differed by region and caste. Priests, for example, wore it in specific ritual folds that aligned with religious ceremonies. Women wore the sari, still famous today. But in ancient times, it looked quite different. It was usually a single piece of up to 9 yards long, wrapped around the waist with one end. The palu, draped over the shoulder or head, it left the midriff bare, not as a fashion statement, but as a gesture of fertility and cosmic openness. In many temples, goddesses were adorned in this exact style, reflecting the sacred femininity of the land. The koli, the blouse worn under a sari, emerged later in history. In earlier periods, upper body coverings varied greatly depending on social norms and climate. In some areas, especially in southern India, women wore the sari without a blouse at all, while in colder regions, shawls and veils were added. Textiles were India's pride. Cotton was first cultivated here, and Indian weavers mastered techniques like block printing, resist dyeing, and fine spinning. The muslin of Bengal was so delicate it was called woven air. Silk, too, was a staple of royal and sacred attire, especially in Buddhist and Jain traditions. Jewelry was worn by all classes: necklaces, bangles, anklets, nose rings. Each piece had astrological, spiritual, or marital meaning. Even children wore talismans to ward off evil. In ancient India, fashion was not bound by fast-changing trends. It was a living philosophy, soft, unstitched, layered in meaning, and always attuned to the divine. In ancient China, fashion was far more than decoration. It was a living system of ethics, cosmology, and imperial order. Whether during the Shang, Zhou, or Han dynasties, what you wore was a reflection of your social role, your harmony with the universe, and your relationship to the emperor. The most iconic garment in early Chinese history was the hanfu, a flowing robe with wide sleeves, a crossed collar, and a sash at the waist. It wasn't just a fashion staple. It was a visual embodiment of Confucian ideals. Modesty, structure, and respect for hierarchy were sewn into every pleat. Men and women alike wore hanfu, but the details, color, fabric, trim, and length differed dramatically based on class, age, and occasion. Colors were strictly regulated. Under the Zhou dynasty, color codes were established to align with the 5 elements: philosophy yellow for earth, center, red for fire, south, blue-green for wood, east, white for metal, west, and black for water, north. Yellow was especially sacred, reserved for the emperor alone. To wear it as a commoner was a direct insult to the throne. Layering was key.
Nobles and scholars wore multiple robes atop one another, not just for warmth or beauty, but as a symbol of refinement. The more layers, the more elevated your rank. Peasants, by contrast, wore simple tunics made of hemp or coarse wool, belted at the waist with trousers or leggings. Silk was strictly the domain of the upper class until its production expanded centuries later. Women's attire varied, but generally echoed the Hanfu silhouette, with added sashes, flowing skirts, and elaborate hairpins. Hair was always styled with care, long and pinned up, often with jade combs, gold ornaments, or floral motifs. The higher and more intricate the hairstyle, the greater the refinement. Hair left loose in public was considered improper for women past childhood. Accessories were laden with meaning. Jade, in particular, was seen as the stone of immortality and virtue. Pendants carved with dragons, phoenixes, or clouds symbolized blessings and moral strength. Even shoes had codes. Pointed tips or elevated soles distinguished the refined from the rustic. In ancient China, fashion was harmony in fabric form. It reflected the natural order, expressed human dignity, and upheld the invisible scaffolding of the empire. To dress properly wasn't just courteous, it was a civic and spiritual duty. To Romanize, the fashion of Celtic and Germanic tribes was wild, impractical, and savage. But to the people who wore it, their clothing wasn't just practical, it was powerfully expressive. Tribal dress reflected warrior culture, kinship, spiritual belief, and a love for bold identity, where Mediterranean fashion emphasized order and hierarchy. The so-called barbarians leaned into individuality and flair. Let's start with the Celts, spread across Gaul, the British Isles, and parts of Central Europe. Celtic men and women wore brightly colored woolen garments, often dyed with natural pigments from plants and minerals. Patterns were a big deal. Plaids and checks weren't just decorative, they were tribal identifiers. Each region or clan had its preferred style. Centuries before Scotland's tartan system developed, men typically wore long-sleeved tunics, belted at the waist, with trousers known as bracha, a radical departure from the robe-based attire of Rome or Greece. These trousers were warm, flexible, and ideal for horseback riding and combat. Warriors often went shirtless into battle, covered in tattoos or blue war paint made from wood, a nod to both intimidation and sacred ritual. Celtic women wore layered dresses or skirts with shawls or cloaks fastened by elaborate brooches, called fibulae. Jewelry was worn in abundance, thick neck rings called torques, bangles, spiral earrings, and amber beads. These items weren't just for show. They marked wealth, tribal role, and sometimes even mystical protection. Hair was another statement. Both men and women braided or coiled their hair, sometimes bleaching it with lime for dramatic effect. Long-styled mustaches and beards were favored by men, especially among warriors and chieftains. Meanwhile, Germanic tribes, from the Goths to the Saxons, had similar clothing strategies. Tunics, wool cloaks, and layered furs dominated their wardrobes. Animal hides, often worn as capes or trimmed with teeth and claws, were both status symbols and talismans. Metalwork on belts, clasps, and weapons often featured motifs of wolves, boars, and eagles, creatures believed to hold spiritual power. Though dismissed as uncivilized by Roman historians, these tribal fashions were deeply meaningful. They emphasized mobility, identity, and a spiritual connection to the land and ancestors. In a world of constant migration and warfare, what you wore was your flag, your shield, and your mythology, stitched into wool, leather, and bone. By the time the Roman Empire evolved into the Byzantine Empire, fashion had become something altogether different, a fusion of Roman authority, Eastern luxury, and Christian symbolism. In Byzantium, clothing wasn't just about status or wealth. It was a sacred language. Every thread, every jewel, every embroidered icon was part of a divine and political performance. The Byzantine court was obsessed with ceremonial dress. The emperor, seen as God's representative on earth, wore garments so intricate and heavily adorned they bordered on the theatrical. His robes, known as the loros, were long jewel-studded bands wrapped elaborately around the body.
Gold thread was common, pearls, sapphires, and garnets were stitched directly into the fabric. To see the emperor was to behold a living icon. Color was strictly regulated. Purple, dyed from the rare murex snail, was the exclusive right of the imperial family. Anyone else caught wearing it could face severe punishment. Even small accents of purple on robes or shoes indicated a connection to the throne. Senators, clergy, and generals had their own color codes and uniform-like outfits for ceremonies. Byzantine fashion was layered and modest. Both men and women wore tunics called dalmatica, with wide sleeves and embroidered bands known as clavi, running vertically down the front. Over these they wore cloaks like the chlamys, fastened with ornate brooches, often shaped like crosses or doves. These layers weren't just practical, they reflected religious values of humility and decorum. Women's fashion in Byzantium was both opulent and devout. Elite women wore long-sleeved robes with tight cuffs, heavily patterned silk fabrics, and elaborate head coverings. Veils and crowns signaled both piety and power. Jewelry was plentiful. Heavy earrings, multi-strand necklaces, and golden belts adorned with religious icons and saints. Even their shoes were embroidered. Christianity influenced everything. Crosses, angels, and sacred inscriptions appeared on belts, pins, and borders of garments. Churches were filled with mosaics depicting saints and royalty in dazzling robes. Real fashion, immortalized in art. Even outside the palace, fashion mimicked the hierarchy. Merchants, scholars, monks, and servants all had clearly defined clothing styles. You didn't just dress for the weather. You dressed for your role in God's order. In Byzantium, fashion wasn't a choice. It was destiny, sanctified by scripture and stitched in silk. Your robe wasn't just a garment. It was your gospel. Before eyeglasses were invented, poor vision was a life sentence, often with serious consequences. If you were nearsighted, reading or fine craftsmanship became nearly impossible. If you were farsighted, sewing, carving, or copying manuscripts was a daily struggle. And yet, for most of human history, there was no solution, just quiet resignation. Ancient civilizations recognized vision problems, but they didn't have the means to fix them. The earliest written reference to impaired vision comes from ancient Egypt. Medical papyri from as early as 1500 BCE describe symptoms that sound a lot like presbyopia, age-related farsightedness, but treatment was largely magical or herbal. There's no evidence of any optical devices. The Greeks and Romans too understood that eyesight could decline with age. Seneca the Younger, in the 1st century CE, reportedly used a glass globe filled with water to magnify text. It worked like a crude magnifying lens, but it wasn't wearable. The first true magnifying lenses came from the Islamic Golden Age. Scholars in Baghdad and Cairo were experimenting with optics as early as the 9th century. The mathematician Al-Hazin, also known as Ibn al-Haytham, wrote the Book of Optics in the 11th century, laying the groundwork for the science of vision. He described how light enters the eye and how lenses could bend it. But again, there's no record of wearable lenses. Instead, ancient and medieval readers used what were known as reading stones, polished hemispheres of glass or crystal placed directly over the text to enlarge it. These tools date back to around the 10th or 11th century in Europe and the Middle East. They were useful, but clunky. You had to press them against the page, and they only helped with one line at a time. The true revolution came in the late 13th century, in northern Italy, likely in the artisan hubs of Pisa or Venice. It was here that craftsmen began producing the first wearable eyeglasses, turning magnifying lenses from stationary tools into something portable and transformative. These early glasses weren't stylish, but they were revolutionary. For the first time in human history, failing eyesight didn't mean the end of a scholar's or artisan's career. The earliest eyeglasses were convex lenses designed to help with presbyopia, age-related farsightedness, which makes reading up close difficult. These were not mass-produced. Each pair was handcrafted by skilled glassmakers and mounted in simple frames made of wood, bone, leather, or metal. There were no temples. These lenses were balanced on the nose or pinched together, sometimes held by hand. The earliest written reference comes from 1306, when a Dominican friar named Giordano da Pisa famously told his congregation that it is not yet 20 years since there was found the art of making eyeglasses, so that one can read and do fine work. That places the invention somewhere around the 1280s. Venetian glassmakers, already masters of fine crystal, played a key role. Their work in Murano, an island dedicated to glassmaking, led to clearer, more uniform lenses. It wasn't long before eyeglasses became a quiet but vital tool for monks, copyists, and aging scholars. These early spectacles weren't personalized. There were no eye exams. Buyers simply tested out lenses to see which one helped the most. The concept of nearsightedness, myopia, wasn't fully understood yet. So lenses for distance vision wouldn't appear for another few centuries. Still, the cultural impact was enormous. In a society that valued literacy, learning, and religious scholarship, eyeglasses gave older individuals a second life. Monks could continue copying texts, doctors could read anatomical diagrams, artists could keep painting intricate details. Aging no longer meant fading into uselessness. The invention spread rapidly across Europe, mostly among clergy and the educated elite. Glasses were expensive, and illiteracy was still widespread, so their use was limited. But word of their utility traveled quickly. By the early 14th century, eyeglasses had reached Germany, France, and England. A simple tool, 2 lenses in a frame, had changed the course of human productivity. For the first time, vision loss was not a final chapter. It was a problem with a solution. As the 14th and 15th centuries rolled on, eyeglasses moved beyond monasteries and into the bustling hands of Europe's growing middle class. The invention of spectacles coincided with the rise of literacy, trade, and urban life, and with it, eyeglasses evolved from obscure scholarly tools to everyday commercial goods, accessible, portable, and increasingly practical. Thanks to the rise of towns and guilds, more people were learning to read. Merchants, artisans, and bureaucrats among them. Reading contracts, ledgers, and inventories required good close-up vision. Presbyopia, still the most common visual issue addressed by spectacles, no longer sidelined older professionals. In a world driven by writing and math, eyeglasses became a silent partner in economic expansion. By the 15th century, eyeglasses were being sold by peddlers, apothecaries, and even street vendors. These were rudimentary models, simple convex lenses mounted in wire or horn frames, held in place by pinching the nose or tying cords around the head. They weren't comfortable, but they worked. For many, it was the first time their world came into clear focus in decades. In 1450, Johannes Gutenberg's printing press changed everything. Suddenly, books could be produced by the hundreds and later by the thousands. As printed material flooded Europe, the demand for eyeglasses surged, literacy rates crept upward, and with them, the need for vision correction. Glasses became more than a scholarly aid. They became tools for the new information age. Eyeglass manufacturing began to specialize. In Nuremberg, Germany, spectacle makers formed one of the first dedicated guilds by the late 15th century. Venice and Florence also became centers of lens production, combining advances in glass clarity with craftsmanship in frame making. These early opticians didn't conduct eye exams, but they developed a range of lenses with differing strengths. Buyers would simply try out lenses at market stalls to find one that suited their needs. The role of glasses in social perception also began to shift. At first, spectacles were a symbol of learning and age. Paintings from the Renaissance often depicted saints, scholars, or apostles in eyeglasses, an emblem of wisdom and spiritual focus. But as the middle class embraced them, glasses also became a sign of literacy, professionalism, and commercial savvy. Eyeglasses were no longer elite curiosities. They were becoming something more radical, useful, widespread, and essential. The 17th century brought a seismic shift in how people understood vision. It wasn't just about practicality anymore. It was about physics. This was the age of Galileo, Kepler, and Newton. Men who not only gazed at the stars, but also cracked open the science behind how light and lenses work.
Their discoveries forever changed both astronomy and optics, pushing eyeglasses from folkcraft to scientific instrument. Johannes Kepler's work in 1604, Ad Vitellionum Paralipomena, laid the foundation for modern optics. He was the first to explain how convex and concave lenses corrected vision, differentiating between myopia, nearsightedness, and hyperopia, farsightedness. For the first time, eyeglass lenses could be understood in terms of precise light refraction, not just trial and error. Meanwhile, Galileo used modified lenses to build the first practical telescope. Others applied similar methods to microscopes. These developments turned humble reading lenses into tools for exploring the universe and the invisible. The same glass that helped someone read a book was now helping humans read the stars and the cell. This new understanding of optics influenced eyeglass makers. With growing knowledge about focal lengths and lens curvature, opticians began crafting more precise corrective lenses. The profession started to professionalize. Spectacle makers in London, Paris, and Amsterdam began referring to themselves as opticians, a term rooted in science, not just trade. Eyeglass frames also saw subtle improvements. While many were still clunky and nose-pinched, some began to include leather nose pads, riveted hinges, or short handles known as temples. Early attempts to anchor glasses more securely. In China, eyeglasses with looped silk cords tied around the ears were already in use, and Europeans slowly adopted similar innovations. Another major leap. Concave lenses for nearsightedness became more common. Previously, most glasses only helped far-sighted individuals. But as understanding of vision disorders grew, so did the range of corrective options. For the first time, a nearsighted young person could wear glasses to see clearly at a distance, expanding the use of spectacles beyond the elderly and scholarly. By the end of the 1600s, eyeglasses had entered a new era. They weren't just functional. They were evidence of Enlightenment thinking, grounded in physics, driven by curiosity, and shaped by expanding literacy. Eyeglasses stood at the intersection of utility and discovery. From now on, improving eyesight would be a matter of science, not just chance. By the 18th century, eyeglasses had not only become more accessible, they had started to become fashionable, no longer confined to the desks of scholars or the toolkits of tradesmen. Spectacles found their way into salons, courts, and coffee houses. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason and refinement, gave rise to a world where intellect was trendy, and so were the tools that symbolized it. Frame design began to improve dramatically. Gone were the awkward nose-pinched contraptions of the Middle Ages. In their place came temple spectacles, glasses with arms that extended over the ears, similar to what we wear today. Invented around the 1720s, these arms made glasses far more stable and comfortable, especially for everyday use. They were sometimes hinged, sometimes made of flexible wire, and often wrapped in silk or ribbon for extra flair. Materials diversified. Frames were crafted from tortoiseshell, horn, silver, and even gold. The elite could commission custom spectacles, complete with engraving or jeweled accents. While function remained important, form was catching up, fast. Public figures helped normalize glasses. Benjamin Franklin, perhaps the most famous bespectacled man of the era, not only wore them, but revolutionized them. In the 1780s, he invented bifocals, cutting two different lenses in half and combining them into one frame so he wouldn't have to switch between reading and distance glasses. It was a practical innovation with lasting impact. At the same time, portable eyewear became popular. The quizzing glass, a single magnifying lens with a handle, became a fashionable accessory among the upper class, especially in Britain and France. People would wear them on a chain around the neck and use them at social gatherings, less for actual vision correction and more to make a statement of wit, wealth, or curiosity. Then came the lorgnette, a pair of spectacles with a handle, popular among aristocratic women. It could be elegantly flicked open and held up for reading or viewing opera performances. For many, it wasn't just about seeing clearly, it was about being seen. Eyeglasses in the 18th century had become markers of sophistication, intellect, and even flirtation. No longer a quiet sign of aging or infirmity, spectacles had joined the fashion world. They now framed more than eyes, they framed identity. The 19th century brought spectacles to the masses. With the rise of the Industrial Revolution came not just steam engines and factories, but a total transformation in how eyeglasses were made, sold, and worn. What had once been artisan-crafted accessories for the few became mass-produced necessities for the many. Before industrialization, glasses were mostly made by hand, one pair at a time. But new machinery allowed for the consistent production of lenses and frames on a large scale. Glass cutting, metal shaping, and lens grinding became faster and more precise. This meant more people could afford glasses and more could finally see clearly. By the mid-1800s, eyeglasses were available in general stores and even by mail-order catalog. You didn't need to visit an optician anymore. Instead, people would test pre-made lenses on their own, trying on different strengths until they found one that worked. While this was far from personalized eye care, it was a giant leap forward in accessibility. Frame styles also expanded. Steel, nickel, and celluloid and early plastic became popular materials, replacing more expensive horn or tortoise shell. The classic pince-nez, a nose-clamping style with no temples, was trendy among both intellectuals and fashion-conscious gentlemen. Meanwhile, round, wire-rimmed glasses, made famous later by figures like Gandhi and John Lennon, became a staple for professionals and students for the first time. Children's eyewear entered the market. As public education spread and literacy soared, so too did the need for vision correction among school-aged kids. Teachers and parents began recognizing that struggling to read a blackboard or book might not mean laziness. It might just mean nearsightedness. Medical understanding of the eye also advanced. Ophthalmology became a formal field, and eye exams began to standardize. In 1862, German ophthalmologist Hermann Snellen created the Snellen chart, the familiar wall chart with rows of shrinking letters, revolutionizing how vision was measured. Meanwhile, glasses became more acceptable in public. In earlier centuries, many hid their need for spectacles out of embarrassment. But in the 19th century, wearing glasses became a sign of seriousness, education, and rising middle-class respectability. Glasses were practical, but also professional. By the dawn of the 20th century, the world was clearer than it had ever been. Glasses were everywhere, in classrooms, factories, courtrooms, and newspapers. Sight had become industrialized, and vision, for the first time in history, was mass-marketed. As the 20th century dawned, eyeglasses were no longer just corrective tools. They were a cultural force. This was the century where vision met identity, where fashion collided with science, and where spectacles became as personal as fingerprints. It was also the beginning of a technological arms race in optics, one that would define modern eye care. In the early 1900s, wire-rimmed glasses remained popular, especially for intellectuals and professionals. But mass production continued to evolve, and with it came new styles, shapes, and materials. By the 1920s and 1930s, celluloid and other plastics allowed for bolder frames, giving rise to more expressive eyewear. Thick black rims became associated with confidence and authority. Eyeglasses were no longer something to hide, they were something to show off. Hollywood played a pivotal role. Actors like Harold Lloyd, who wore round, horn-rimmed glasses, made spectacles part of his signature look. Later, stars like Marilyn Monroe, James Dean, and Audrey Hepburn wore glasses both on and off screen. Glasses that emphasized their personality, not their impairments. During World War II, innovation accelerated. Military demand for better optics led to advancements in lens durability, anti-reflective coatings, and lightweight frame design. The military also issued standardized glasses, nicknamed GI glasses, or, less affectionately, birth control glasses for soldiers. These weren't flattering, but they were durable and accessible. In 1958, a huge leap occurred. The invention of plastic lenses, lighter and safer than glass. They changed the comfort game entirely, combined with the development of photochromic lenses, which darken in sunlight. Glasses became more versatile for everyday wear. Then came contact lenses. Though invented earlier, it wasn't until the 1950s and 60s that soft contacts became commercially viable. Suddenly people had a choice. You could wear glasses or not. Meanwhile, fashion exploded. The 1960s saw cat-eye frames and mod-inspired colors. The 70s brought oversized aviators. The 80s were all about big, bold statements. Think Run DMC and Wall Street executives. And by the 90s, minimalist styles returned, with rimless and wireframes ruling boardrooms and universities alike. Eyeglasses were no longer just tools for sight. They were statements of politics, of intellect, of rebellion, of style. Whether you were a beat poet in Greenwich Village or a Silicon Valley coder, your glasses said something about who you were. The 20th century didn't just correct vision, it reframed it. The 21st century brought eyeglasses into a whole new frontier, the digital world, as screens became our constant companions, on our desks, in our pockets, even on our wrists. Our eyes began to pay the price, and so, eyewear had to evolve once again. From medical marvel, to fashion staple, to high-tech necessity, glasses became smarter, lighter, and more personalized than ever before. One of the most significant developments has been the rise of digital lens crafting. Unlike earlier eras where lenses were molded from preset prescriptions, modern glasses are now shaped with computer-guided precision. This allows for customized lenses tailored to your exact eye measurements, head tilt, reading distance, and more. Progressive lenses, which offer a seamless blend between near, middle, and far vision, have improved dramatically, eliminating the dizzying distortions that plagued early designs. Another innovation: blue light blocking technology. As people began spending 8, 10, or even 12 hours a day staring at screens, reports of digital eye strain skyrocketed. Dry eyes, headaches, blurred vision. These became the new normal. Lens companies responded by developing coatings that filter out high-energy blue light, reducing fatigue and improving sleep for some users. Whether or not the science is conclusive, demand has soared. Frame technology also leapt forward. Ultralight materials like titanium, memory metal, and carbon fiber made glasses more durable and comfortable. Some frames are now so thin and feather-light, wearers forget they're even on. Others integrate flexible hinges, hypoallergenic coatings, and modular designs for personalization. Then came smart glasses. While early attempts like Google Glass had a rocky start, met with both awe and backlash, the concept of augmented eyewear hasn't disappeared. Modern versions now include audio capabilities, camera integration, fitness tracking, and even heads-up displays. Companies continue refining the balance between function and style, hoping to make smart glasses an everyday accessory. Eyewear retail has changed too. Online platforms now let users upload a selfie, try on frames virtually, and receive prescription lenses without ever entering a store. This democratization of access, combined with stylish branding, has turned glasses into an e-commerce industry. And let's not forget fashion. From hipster round frames to sleek minimalism to vintage revivals. Glasses today are expressions of identity more than ever. In the digital age, glasses don't just help you see, they help you filter, protect, compute, and express exactly who you are. As we peer into the future of eyeglasses, the lines between technology, biology, and fashion continue to blur. We're now entering an era where correcting vision is just the beginning, where glasses might enhance human ability, serve as wearable computers, or eventually disappear altogether. The future isn't just about seeing better, it's about seeing differently. One of the most promising frontiers is smart eyewear. Companies like Meta, Apple, and Amazon are racing to develop glasses that integrate seamlessly with augmented reality, AR. The idea is to overlay digital information, navigation, notifications, translations, even 3D objects, onto your field of view, all without taking out a phone. These devices aim to do what smartphones did for communication: make it instant, invisible, and immersive. At the same time, prescription lenses are getting even more advanced. Some companies are experimenting with adaptive lenses that adjust focal length automatically. No more bifocals, no more switching glasses. With liquid crystal or electrochromic technology, these lenses can respond to your gaze, lighting conditions, or visual needs in real time. Medical technology is also taking bold steps forward. Gene therapies and stem cell treatments for certain types of blindness are showing promise in early trials. Bionic eyes, once a science fiction fantasy, are already in development, with retinal implants and brain-computer interfaces aiming to restore partial vision to the blind. If these technologies mature, eyeglasses might shift from corrective tools to transitional devices, eventually replaced by internal or solutions. But the humble eyeglass frame isn't going away just yet. In fact, fashion continues to keep glasses relevant, even as they become more high-tech. Designers are blending tradition with futurism. 3D printed frames, recycled materials, modular designs, and customizable colors are all keeping glasses personal and wearable. Meanwhile, virtual reality headsets, once bulky and awkward, are slimming down, borrowing heavily from optical science to create immersive experiences in sleek, goggle-like form. These two, in a sense, are the spiritual successors of the lens. What started as a monk's reading aid in 13th century Italy has now become a gateway to digital worlds, a medical marvel, and a cultural icon. The story of eyeglasses isn't just about helping us see the world more clearly. It's about how the world has come to see us, and how that vision continues to evolve, one lens at a time.